Hello and welcome back to the Wheel Talk podcast. My name is Abby Mickey. We are here to talk about women's professional road cycling and also a little bit of Paralympics today. With me, Gracie Elvin.
Hello, hello.
Lauren Rowney.
I'll start with g'day then.
Today we have some listener questions. We got some amazing audio messages, and thank you so much for sending audio messages in. It's quite nice to hear other people's voices instead of hearing our own voices for a change. So we'll answer some questions and talk a little bit about the Paralympics that started over the weekend. But I wanted to start this episode with something that we've been putting off for quite some time. And it's the perfect time of year to do it. Lauren, you want to tell us about your Trofeo d'Or win in 2015?
Fun fact for that to start with, Kimber's, Gracie Elvin's partner, was on the team that year. And she got, I think Kimber's won maybe the first sprint stage of that race. I don't know if you know the facts there, Gracie. So we were on the Australian national team together. And my best friend, Carly Taylor, for anyone who knows me and has sort of followed my friendship there, she was racing for Lotto at the time. I can't remember what the name was, Lotto Belisol back then, or Sudal probably. And I think it was every summer basically I would join the national team, because back in those days, when there was the team's time trial, was a big focus of my trade team, Specialized Lululemon, and then Velocio SRAM. Basically anyone who was in the TTT team would take up the whole summer program in terms of racing. So I was kind of one of those riders left out. And the national team always had like a little spot for me. So I'd always join for 3 weeks to a month of racing, and always had a lot of success at this race. But what was a bittersweet win for this one was I wasn't actually going for the win that day as such. It was just that Rachel Neylan was in the yellow jersey and Carly Taylor was trying to take it off her. And she'd gone up the road and I basically had to chase her down. And in doing so, I was chasing so hard that I managed to, I brought her back. And then I was like still feeling kind of good. So I like slotted back into the peloton, took a breath, and then it was a downhill sprint, and somehow managed to take the win there too, which was a bit of a random thing. But bittersweet, because I chased down my best friend and took away her GC opportunity. She still ended up third, but that was kind of crap, because after the finish line, she was like, "Oh my God, you won the sprint." I'm like, "Yeah, but I was the one who was chasing you down. I'm really sorry about that." This was before TV coverage. So that's the story behind that win there. Was a bit of a random win, but yeah.
You could have just not told her.
I could have what? Yeah,
just
I know. But I just, yeah. I'm sure it would have come up. They were like, her teammates would have been like, "Yeah, it was Lauren that was chasing you down." We still went on holiday that year, so all was well in the world. But that's bike racing when you're in the race, huh? Doesn't matter who your friends are.
It's a cool win. You must have been bloody fit back then to do that kind of effort and then still sprint well.
Yeah, I think we were, that whole team that week, we were just flying. And I was climbing all right back then as well, like on those shorter, punchier ones, but definitely surprised myself. It was just kind of one of those opportunities where I was one of maybe 2 or 3 left in the team, and Rachel was safe. And so she was like, "Yeah, I'm just go for it if you want." And then I just put myself in the position and went for it.
Cool. And those French races are memorable because they were like the worst accommodation and food.
Yes. Yeah. We had like a ton of fun, and it was like in terms of strength, you get some decent names, but it was never like the very, very top riders at those races. So you'd sometimes get like Giorgia Bronzini showing up, or I can't think of names off the top of my head, but it was a great opportunity for the then national team, because they bring in a couple of pros who would then sort of go into that captaincy role and mentorship role. And, you know, we had Shannon Mulseed that year, Janelle Crooks, I think. Kimbers was over there. So it was great in that respect, and I enjoyed the racing. And I think it was the Route de France. The first year I did it was about 8 or 9 days of racing. But a lot of those tours have fallen away now, which is a bit sad for the calendar, because I learnt a hell of a lot, and I just enjoyed the mentoring aspect of being with the Aussie team.
Yeah, those races would be like super for this second tier of racing or under 23 races.
I mean, I was always just a domestique in my trade team, so there was very few opportunities I got to have a crack. Yeah, so it was always like, if you're given the opportunity, you put your hand up straight away.
It's tough, like constantly going just to the top races, all the World Tour races. It was so nice. I love going to Touringen for that reason, because you just can build your confidence back up again and potentially go for a win yourself if you're not in that domestic role as much. Yeah, I think even the best pros need to go to not World Tour races sometimes just to get the feeling of winning back and learning how to win again, because you can lose that, I think.
Yeah, and I think that's quite an interesting point when you look at someone like Cassia, as the calendar has developed, and she's had some bad luck along the way, but always turning up to the absolute top tier races. I guess for her, just as an example, she never really had those opportunities to step back, get that winning feeling, and then come back to a World Tour race. But that just goes to show how the calendar and the racing's evolved. And she said it in an interview before that the very top riders are just so targeted now, and their race days are far less, but it's like every race they show up to, they're there to win or to try to win.
Yeah, we still have a couple, like starting tomorrow or today, as you're listening to this podcast, it's Ardèche, which used to be longer, but is, 5 stages this year and 6 stages this year. And there's 2 World Tour teams showing up. EF Ole Cannondale is there. But for the most part, it's like some of the teams are sending their Devo teams, like Canyon SRAM Generation and Liv Alula Jayco's development team as well. But that's such a good race for kind of getting a little bit more experience and trying to get a win. Mm-hmm. And usually where it sits on the calendar, there actually aren't that many World Tour teams that show up to Ardèche.
Yeah, I think previously some riders would go there as a tune-up race before Worlds, like getting that one last really hard race, particularly if Worlds is going to be a hilly one. You'd see some of the top climbers show up, but it used to clash around the time, I think, of the Holland Ladies Tour. So then you'd have more of the, we'll say, what before the World Tour type riders going to that race.
Yeah, it is a good, like in years past, sometimes the US team has sent their Worlds team just to Ardèche. They did that in 2018, I remember, and they've done it other times as well. But that was a race where like Kasia went to kind of get some confidence. One of my favorite moments in my entire career happened at Ardèche in 2018 with Kasia. There was like one stage that it started and then it was just straight up, like start and then just like a 15-kilometer climb, and then it descended, and the climb was neutral, which just sucked even more because you're going so slow that riders were like running into each other. It was just total chaos. And then they made it not neutral with 5K to go to the top. So then everyone just started like sprinting for the last 5K to try to get to the front before the descent. And I somehow ended up on Kasia's wheel, and we were descending down this descent, and we got to the bottom, and I like looked around, and there everyone was gone. And I was like, she turned around, and she was like, "You're here," and I was like, "I'm here." and then she started riding, and she dropped me, but it was amazing. And then she won the race, the whole thing. But it's such a good race, Ardèche. I do wish we had more races like that. Like, you have US teams coming over for this race, like DNA is here. One of their final races before the team folds at the end of the season. Synisca is there as well. What will be one of the only US teams that comes over to Europe next year, with Lauren Stevens. they're there. Good race. Also great accommodations for that race. It's like a pinwheel style, so you stay at the same campground the whole time, and you don't have to like. It's the same as Turingen. Turingen, you stay in the same hotel the whole time and then transfer to stages. But it just makes the race so much easier to host for smaller teams, especially, and not have to like run all over the place to try to move from hotel to hotel in between stages.
Yeah, I feel like it's a Center Parks type accommodation, right? Like where families would go in the summer, but obviously summer holidays are over now, so it like clears out, and then it's just this bunch of cyclists that come. It's a beautiful region, Ardèche. So, I mean, you don't have much time to take it in while you're racing because that race is just so hard. But yeah, great race.
The year I did it, we did. I think we did Von too.
Yeah, I never did Von 2, but I did win a stage there in 2014 and beat Giorgia Bronzini only because I got a massive jump on the whole peloton. I did a little sneaky fly up the outside before one of the corners.
Nice.
Gracie, do you have an early career story you want to share?
I met Bronzini at Trofeo d'Or in 2012. So I was racing in the Farron Honda team in the Italian team for the second half of the season in that year. So I was racing with Fabiana Luperini, Nicole Cook, Rochelle Gilmore, and a bunch of Russians and Italians. And a lot of them were friends with Bronzini, so I kind of met her once. She speaks English well, but she doesn't speak it a lot. And I didn't speak much Italian, so we didn't really chat too much. And I remember we stayed in some school dormitory and the mattresses were plastic. And there was a school canteen where we would get dinner that night and they would like ration your food so you couldn't really go back for seconds. And it was just so gross. It was like French pasta, which is like, just think of pasta that's been cooked twice. It's just all grey and sticks together. Yeah, I certainly didn't perform very well back in those days, but I learned a lot and it kind of set me up for the rest of my career. So it was still some good memories despite it being brutal and being around staff that I could barely communicate with.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I remember I did Route to France 2012, which would have been maybe, it was just post-Olympics. So right after the Olympics, I went over there with Evie Stevens and like a really small team. We had a lot of fun, but that was my first introduction to European racing. And it was like staying in old schools. Well, the schools that are just not open because the kids, of course, are on summer vacation and the whole canteen thing. And I remember being so hungry. And like I went back in the line to take like another bread roll or something. And then the chef started yelling at me in French and my teammates were just laughing at me. And I was so embarrassed because like the whole dining hall is just full of teams. And I was like very new to racing overseas. And I still remember that. I'm like, okay,
what a fight.
don't steal food from the French.
Yeah. Well, my Italian team, the staff were always like, if you just lose 3 kilos, you will be so much better. And I felt so starved for that 6 months or 3 months, I should say, being on that team because they were always like watching what I was eating and I was always sneaking food. And I learned very quickly to bring snacks always to races because they were not going to be provided for you.
Such a different, we talked about this a bit at the tour, like off mic. Like what a different world it is now. Like all the teams have chef vans, and like when we recorded the preview podcast on the FDJ bus, we got like a tour of their setup and they have like a whole van with like a little like fold out bar with stools and stuff with like food, and just a very different world for when we were racing.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, but honestly, like, yeah, I think we just have the best memories. Like if our whole team got together and we had a dinner or a catch up or something, the stuff that would come out would just, yeah, It's still ingrained in my memories, and I'm sure when I'm an old woman, I'll still be talking about those days.
Oh, but that was one of the reasons that Tour of Britain was so popular.
Oh,
'Cause,
it was
like,
ritzy.
yeah, you stayed in such nice hotels, and then the like buffet was actually like quite good. Versus like I remember when we raced Binda, Trofeo Alfredo Binda, we were staying in the same hotel as the men's Movistar team that were racing Milan San Remo, and the meals that they got served by the same kitchen were like they got like pizza and like all this stuff, and then they just would plop down like disgusting pasta in front of us, and a bowl of pasta that like was just ugh, and rice and like boiled chicken. We're just like, come on, I know you can do better. Look at what
And this is why I could never eat pasta or rice back home. I don't know why. I just was put off it.
I couldn't eat rice for years.
Yeah, I've eaten a lot of rice.
Yeah.
Well, we've got some great questions from people, but we also wanted to mention the Paralympics that are happening at the moment. We had the track events over the weekend starting on Thursday, and the road events start on Wednesday of this week with the time trials and road races on Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And first and foremost, Paralympics means parallel to the Olympics, in case people didn't know. This was a fun fact that I learned back in the day from my old teammate Greta Niemenis, who raced the Paralympics and raced for the same team as me back in the U.S. Phenomenal human being, one of my just favorite teammates that I've ever had in my life. And she explained, that Paralympics means parallel to the Olympics. It's a parallel event. Meg Fisher, who's a 10 times world champion and Paralympic gold medalist, wrote an awesome story on Cycling Weekly about breaking down the different classifications, because I wrote in the newsletter kind of the schedule of road events coming up on Wednesday with the time trials and road races. But there's a lot of different classifications in the Paralympics that can be a bit hard to understand if you don't actually know what it means. But like women's competition in the Olympics, the Paralympics is also growing massively. And this year there's 51 medals on offer in the cycling events and 220 athletes competing, 17 track events and 24 road events, with 15 road races and 19 time trials. The classifications are based on the variety of impairments and the type of bike used. So there's 4 different types of bike used in the Paralympic cycling events. There's a typical bike, which is classed as a C, a tandem bike for visually impaired, for the most part, that's a B, and a hand cycle bike, that's an H, and a tricycle, which is a T. And then 4 categories that ensure athletes with similar capabilities compete against each other. There's 12 classifications across men's and women's, 5 C categories, 5 H categories, a B category, and 2 T categories. So basically, if you have a C5 athlete, they have a greater physical ability than a C1 athlete, for example. And like H3 is more physically capable than an H2. But Meg breaks it down really well in this article on Cycling Weekly. So I'll link that in the show notes for everyone to check out, because I think it's really helpful when looking at the schedule of events coming up. It can be, there's a lot of events, and so it's nice to understand what each of them means.
Thanks for that breakdown.
It is confusing, but it's like once you get to know the categories and stuff, it definitely makes sense. And I love some of the sports. Like I've been enjoying watching some of the wheelchair basketball and rugby, and they have different scoring for each player depending on their capabilities as well. So like within the same event, you can have different levels, and it's fascinating and kind of cool when it adds up to like the overall score of the games and stuff. So I've been enjoying getting to know some of the other sports as well. But coming from cycling, it's cool to watch some of our Aussies doing so well already. I think we've already claimed a couple of golds and some silvers in women and men. But also hearing the backstories too. Much like at the Olympics, it adds such a richness to the achievements of these athletes. And Petricola, who won the women's pursuit back to back. So she's a double gold Paralympic champion now, and she's struggles with MS, and that's a kind of condition that is not a steady state or like a linear progressive type of thing. So you're not really sure if you're going to be in a bad way that week or even struggle to recover from the heats and to be able to back up your performances. So what these athletes are doing is incredible anyway, and then just having to be adaptable and resilient and still front up despite some extra challenges. Like, I just think it's awesome and really inspiring. And when you look at some of the times that a lot of these athletes are posting, like in track cycling or in track and field, what they're doing is really impressive.
Oh yeah, there's a young woman from the Gold Coast that I follow. Her father used to be part of the cycling community when I was living there. So Alexa Leary, I'm sure any Australians listening to this would be familiar now with her story, because the news in Australia has covered her. I think even globally, her story is just really incredible. And I've been following her since she had that traumatic brain injury from a crash she had on her bike. She was quite a good up and coming triathlete, and then had this horrendous crash where she should have died, but just a series of events happened that meant that, there happened to be a doctor cycling up the other side of the hill that stopped and was able to put her in the right position and open her airways. And then an ambulance was only 10 minutes away when it should have taken more than that, because they were in a bit of a rural area where they were cycling. And so I've been following her story, and just to see like what she's achieved. And I think she came into the Olympics. This is her first Paralympics, with the ambition of maybe trying to go for gold in the 50 meter. She's still got her 100 meter event coming up. And she just fell short, but she actually broke the world record, or the world record and the Olympic record, in her heat. And then I think a few minutes later, the American then broke it. But just watching her journey has been really, really inspiring. And there are a million of these stories, but it's just interesting when you find one that's sort of close to home, and then you follow their whole trajectory. And like you said, Gracie, we're always in awe of what athletes can do, but when you face this sort of level of adversity, I just think that the stories behind these athletes are so much greater. I don't know if that's the word, but you get more invested in the story.
And I just think they're just gonna, it's just more visibility too. You don't have to be into sports, but just there's I can't remember what the exact number is, but it's like 1.3 billion people around the world have some kind of disability or impairment, and that's a lot of people that are going to watch the Paralympics and take courage from that. And also able-bodied people, I take courage from these stories as much as I take courage and inspiration from the Olympians as well. So yeah, I think the more visibility for people of all types, I think it's better for everyone.
Yeah, and there's more live coverage of the Paralympics this year than there ever has been. So it's even easier to watch it now than it was 3 years ago for Tokyo, which is amazing.
Yeah, I think Paris is doing a really good job, and all of the broadcasts has been great so far. Watching from Australia, I've been watching the Stan Sport coverage, and they've been putting really nice daily highlight packages together, exactly the same as they were for the Olympics. So it's been really cool to see. I like watching the panel shows break stuff down because I learn a bit, and they have good insights because they've got their experts. And yeah, I've been enjoying hearing some of the stories so far.
I was listening to a podcast with Ellie Cole, who's one of the most decorated Australian para swimmers, and she's retired now. And she was saying, with broadcasting rights with the Paralympics, because every year it's growing so much, I think you can only bid every 4 years or something. Whereas, like, say Channel 7 will own the rights for the next 2 or 3 Olympics. It's different with the Paralympics because of the growth. They can't really determine how much it's going to grow or something like that. So yeah, that's why some of the channels that you might have expected would have it don't.
I'm excited for the road events coming up. Starting Wednesday, and the road races this weekend, and then track and field. My favorite events.
Love the track. love, but I really enjoy the other sports like Gracie was mentioning. I wasn't aware of the different scoring, but tactically, as like the team coach on the sideline, if there's different points, I don't want to digress too much. For each player, it'd be interesting to see the tactics of that and how you sort of play out the game.
Yeah, it's really interesting. The basketball and the rugby are worth watching for that, just to see the tactics behind it. It's really cool, but it's brutal. Like it's amazing what they're doing in wheelchairs. They're slamming into each other. The skill that they have, and some of these people have upper limb amputations as well, and they're just wheeling around like Fast and Furious. It's just absolutely incredible what they can do. So I'm really enjoying it.
I've also loved seeing how many fans are in Paris on the ground, like in the stadiums and stuff, because it's been really, really cool. One of my friends went to the track events and it's been like completely packed, the velodrome. And yeah, the track and field events and the swimming events as well have been like almost selling out, which is just so cool to see. All right, should we answer some questions?
Yeah, that's what they're waiting for. I think there's a few people waiting for this.
We have a question from Dan Owens from a while back that we didn't get around to answering on the last Q&A. So we're going to start with that one. Dan asks if we recall a time in the past when a similar number of big name riders were on the move. Is it good for the sport? And what are the potential positives/negatives of being a top tier contender at a team like UAE and FEJ?
Good question. I don't think that we've seen so many people on the move, but it is common to have more movement post an Olympic year. So we have definitely seen years where you've seen a bit more movement than normal, usually post games. But I think, yeah, we're really seeing a good shake up now, and that's really speaking to the budgets across the board now. This also the spread of talent. So I think even if you could get good money, you're not sure if you're going to get the team to back you up, and we're seeing that now. So I think people are really shopping around because they know that there's a whole bunch of teams that they could not just get good money, but also get good support from teammates, from good equipment, from good staffing, good coaching. Lots of riders have their bucket list, much like shopping for property. You've got your priorities and you're trying to, tick some of those boxes. And I think that so many teams now can offer a whole lot of stuff. So yeah, I think it's a good marketplace now if you're a top rider. It's not just wiggle or bowls dolmens.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I wrote down in response to this question, that what we're seeing now compared to 3, 4, 5 years ago, it's not just the top riders, but you're even seeing like the midfield onwards, like the really super domestiques. Everyone has a rider agent now. And before that really didn't exist. I think Lizzie Deignan was one of the first people that I was aware with that really had an agent. This is 10 years ago. So I think that's a big part of it. Now they've got people working for them. There's a lot more chatter. Whereas before, no one really knew what everyone was earning. It was very hush-hush. Most people weren't earning a lot. It was just a few riders at the very top that were earning decent salaries. Going back to the Wiggle Honda point that Gracie made, I think Rochelle, you can criticize her for a lot of things she did, but one of the things she did do was she was paying really good wages. And I think I think you've spoken about this before, Gracie, was kind of one of the instigators in getting at least those top riders to a certain level in the market. Like they knew they could go and ask for $100,000. So yeah, I think the rider agents is a big point there to be made, because yeah, they've got people working for them now and they know what the market value is. And there are more than 1 or 2 teams that can offer really good deals in terms of what Gracie's already mentioned, good working environments, depending on type of rider you are, what goals and ambitions you have, and length of contract.
And like to tie into the second part of that question, like I think before if you were a good rider, but maybe not the marquee rider of the team, and you wanted to become the top leader in a team, you'd have to take that risk and go to a smaller team with potentially less support around you, whether it be riders to help you in races or good team arrangements, all that stuff. But I think that's, like I said before, I think the depth of professionalism is much more across the board now, pretty much all teams. So I think you're taking less of a risk to go to another team. So when we see riders like Elisa Longa-Borghini leaving Lidl Trek and going to UAE, I think she's going to be totally fine. Whereas even 5 years ago, look to going to a smaller team to get those leadership opportunities, but that comes with more risk. So I think now I think these top riders who really are backing themselves, I think that they've got more options and more teams to choose from.
Yeah, and in the case of like Eliza, for example, switching teams, the team that she's going to has the budget to be able to promise her domestiques that she trusts, which is not really something that happened in the past. You couldn't be a leader going to a team and say, well, I'm bringing XYZ with me to my new team, because teams just didn't have the budget for something like that. And now we have teams that have such bigger budgets and are willing to invest more in their women's teams like UAE, and are willing to say, yeah, if you want those riders to come with you to the new team, then absolutely we'll sign them. And so that's something that, yeah, like arguably you could say that Eliza is going to a smaller team, but the team that they're building around her, once we know the finality of who is joining her on UAE and who they're going to have supporting her, it's not going to look like a small team anymore, or a team that can't compete with the bigger teams. And there will always be growing pains when you have situations like that. Like I think, Little Trek have signed some really, really strong riders along with keeping a number of their current riders. And there will be growing pains that come with those changes. There always are. But sometimes injecting kind of some new names into a team can save the team. So I think, well, in terms of next year, I feel like it's only a good thing, the amount of changes in the peloton that we're going to see. It's definitely looking like SD Works Pro Time is not going to be the big bad based on how many teams are kind of cultivating really, really strong rosters. And of course, we'll see how that actually shakes out next year. But you have teams like Visma Lisa Bike, who they have a clear goal and they're signing riders based on that clear goal, and UAE as well. FDJ, they clearly want to win the Tour de France Femme, and whether that be with their current riders, their new riders like Juliette Labousse, who they've already announced, they are going to do everything in their power and everything with their budget to back that. And I think it's only good for the sport. And the more that we have that talent distributed across teams, the more interesting the racing is. And we're going to see that next year.
Hi, this is Leslie Galiner calling in from Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. I was wondering if you knew of any interesting or unusual origin stories from women in the pro peloton. Some of us have heard of Kristen Faulkner's or Justine Higuera's in light of their successes this summer. But what are some other unique stories of how some of the riders came to fall in love with the bike and into racing? Love the pod. It's the reason I joined DC. Keep up the amazing work. Thanks so much.
One of the first riders that came to mind for me first of all, thank you so much, Leslie, for your voice memo and for your question. One of the riders that came to mind for me was a rider that Tilda Price was raving about the entire Tour de France Femme, and that's Valentina Cavalar, the Austrian rider who is currently on Arkea B&B Hotels and is signed for that team through 2027. Such an interesting signing because prior to 2023, she'd never raced a road race, and actually on her first cycling page, there's no UCI races in 2023. So Arkea B&B obviously believed in her enough to sign her on a 4-year deal or like a 3 and a bit year deal, because they signed her only in March of this year. And she had an incredible ride on the final stage of the Tour de France Femme this year that kind of, maybe put her name in front of people. But she's also just such a fascinating individual who she's only 23, but to come into the sport with basically no prior experience and score a contract like that with a team that, then goes on to race the Tour de France Femme. And she's had some pretty decent results. She was second at the Austrian national championships. She was second overall at the the Pyrenees race earlier this year. Second in the mountains classification at Zulia. So, she's really strong, but she's actually come to cycling from rowing. And she went to the Olympics for rowing in the past and then switched over to road only in 2023.
Yeah. I was just going to bring up the rowers. Rowers always transition into great cyclists for a multitude of reasons, but the number one for me is that they can just suffer like nothing. And I know this because I'm married to an ex-rower, so I've seen the level of suffering that he can endure, and it's incredible. I'm trying to think. I think Grace Brown, she came from a track and field background, right? I don't know, Gracie, if you know a bit more about that.
Yeah, she was a really good runner, like middle distance runner. But obviously, we hear the story not too rarely is that they get injured and then they turn to cycling for staying fit, and then they decide they love it. So yeah, that was kind of Grace's story. Is she was a very good runner, and injury kind of pushed her into cycling, and she just really took it from there. So good for the sport that she did jump across. Another person that comes to mind, she's not in road, but she's very much road adjacent, is her affectionately known as G, but Karike Schurz. She was the soigneur for the Trek team for ages. Like, she's very recognizable. You'd see her at every race, super friendly, lovely person. And this past 12 months, she's been totally kicking ass in the gravel racing scene. So she decided to take the leap and pursue her own athletic dreams. I think she did race road and probably a bit across back when she was younger, and then went into the soigneur side of the sport. But I think she still had that itch that she needed to scratch, and she's been doing really well. So I like that story.
Yeah, that's a great one. She's of the era of Anna van der Breggen. So I think anyone that follows Anna or G on social media would have seen they just did a bikepacking trip from Alpe d'Huez to Girona, which is 800 kilometers, with former Olympian and sprint superstar Kirsten Wild. But G is absolutely crushing it, and I would argue that she would have been a very, very good road cyclist had she stuck with it years ago.
Yeah, I think Anna van der Breggen herself has said that G had a lot of potential when they were racing when they were younger. Before she went over to the Swanee side, but was really excited to support her when she decided to really go for the gravel after last year.
But like women's cycling, you can pretty much dig into almost every rider's story and, find something interesting out. And I think women's cycling has a very high rate of tertiary educated people. So a lot of cyclists have uni degrees and often have professions before they've come into cycling. And it's changing a bit now. We're certainly seeing a younger flock of riders coming through and doing well and not having a career beforehand. But certainly in the generation that the three of us came through, a lot of women would have already done a uni degree, or at least still studying one while racing, some of them having started a career. Evelyn Stevens was similar to the story of Kristen Faulkner. She was a Wall Street gal. Like I said, it's a lot of people had already done stuff, and they could have, because you weren't necessarily, I'm not being very articulate here. The age thing wasn't as important as it is in men's cycling, I guess. They didn't have to be superstar under 23s to, come over and do well. My partner, Kimberly Wells, had already done a medical degree before she won that stage in Trophy Door and a bunch of other races in Europe and America. So that's not an unusual story. There's plenty of doctors in the peloton as well.
Yeah, it's almost more common for riders in the women's peloton to come from a different sport or come into the sport late than it is for riders who raced, when they were younger and raced their whole lives to kind of build up to the one of my favorite riders, Elise Chabi. She competed in the 2012 Summer Olympics in slalom canoe, and only came over to the road for cycling in 2018. I think she started her road career with Kogas, which is now Roland, and she's also a doctor.
Well, I bumped into Tanya Irath. Some people might have heard her on the commentary team with, I think, Ant McCrossan. On the very last night, I happened to be at dinner with her, and it was funny how she was there and she was just taking her summer break, but she's very much Dr. Irath now, and she just jumped back into that. They're just some incredible women, and I'm always inspired and feel very uneducated. Even though I have a tertiary degree, it's still, I did my bachelor's.
They can be intimidating.
It is a little bit. I'm more intimidated by that than anything else. I think I've spoken about this with Gracie, is well-educated people. Damn, I wish I'd done my master's in biology. That's really cool.
There's still time.
Hi, Abby, Lauren, and Gracie, and Matt if you're there. This is Lay Mango from the Wheel Talk channel on Discord. First of all, I want to say thank you so much for your podcasts. You guys just do such amazing work. I love listening to it. I love the Wheel Talk newsletter. I love everything that you guys are doing. So more power to you guys, and please keep doing what you're doing. To Abby and Lauren, I wish I could have met you guys in Rotterdam, but I guess it'll have to be another time. Anyway, I popped some questions in the chat on the Wheel Talk channel, but I'll repeat one question here and I'll add a few more questions in this voice message, if that's okay. So the first one, which was in the chat, was what was your take on young riders? So U23, U19 riders getting multi-year contracts on World Tour teams. Can World Tour teams provide the right environment for these young riders to grow?
I feel like this is a sometimes maybe good, sometimes maybe bad type situation, because some U23 or U19 riders really are at a level to race World Tour. Take Shirin Van Anrooy, for example. The Little Trek team has done a really great job of developing her as a rider and not putting too much pressure on her to develop too quickly. And they've been really great about her progression throughout her career, allowing her to still race cyclocross and being careful with her. I feel like there are definitely situations where you have younger riders that are not ready for a World Tour contract that would really benefit from a lower level team that are getting World Tour contracts because they show so much promise and because the option is there and there's just less opportunity for them on a lower level. I think it'll change next year once we have pro team teams and it's kind of broken up a little bit more. But if you flip, Little Trek have done a great job with Shirin, but then at the same time they have 5 riders that they signed at the age of 18, 19 that have raced barely at all this year that could have all really benefited from just a development program instead. And had the team put the budget into a development program for those riders instead of signing them onto a World Tour contract, which requires a minimum salary and all of that. And of course, I think those riders should be paid. But at the same time, if you're not paying them the minimum salary of a World Tour contract, you can afford to take them to smaller races and give them opportunities to learn and grow. But you have a team like Little Trek that have big ambitions. They want to win world tour races. They want to win the tour. They want to win, the classics. And they don't have the means or the budget to be able to also make sure that these 5 riders get the development that they need to progress in their careers. So I think it's really a case by case basis whether these riders should be getting world tour contracts. And like, if you look at Canyon SRAM, for example, they've done an amazing job at taking riders from their development team and moving them up to their world tour team when they're ready. And we saw, Antonia Niedermeyer and Ricardo Bauernfeind have success last year at a world tour level after the generation team was able to really help them in their development as riders for the time that they spent on the generation team. So yeah, I think my answer is it depends on the rider and it depends on the team.
I agree with you there. And just to talk a little bit more about Canyon SRAM, on the last day I was hanging around the buses there and speaking to just a few of the old staff members that I know from my time with that team many years ago. And I was asking about one of the DSs, Adam, who was the main DS during the Tour de France Femme. And I was asking Lars, the Swanee, about it. And I said, he worked with the generation team. And obviously that was really good for him to get a feel for the organization and then move up to the main World Tour team. And he was like, he stopped me there and he said, we're one team. We really don't see them as separate teams. Yes, it's a development team, but we really just see it all as one, and not that they're separate and they're different and they're doing their own thing. So I thought that was really interesting. But I have to agree, I really like what they're doing with the generation team. They're really fostering the talent and putting them in races where we've just discussed early in the podcast. We have an opportunity to fine-tune your racecraft and have a go and learn to race as a team and not go into a world tour event where your job may be just the first 60 kilometers. But if you're just doing that all the time and you're getting shelled out the back and not completing races, that can crack certain people, particularly if you're used to coming from a junior background where you're winning everything.
And my second and third question are related to Fenix-Deceuninck and how they have performed at tour. I love the story of Paulina Royackers transferring to a new team, and this led to a GC podium. So which riders would get a second life or suddenly be a top name to consider if they move to a new team, either through GC or Classics rider? And this could be a rider that whose transfer has already been announced, or a rider whose transfer has not yet been announced, or a transfer that you would like to happen. And then finally, my last question is, what do you think about the Fenix-Deceuninck model of success? It seems every Tour de France Femme avec Swift, they seem to overperform, and we don't hear or see so much from them from the rest of the year. They train specifically for the Tour, and it's paid off a lot, the last couple of seasons. So what can small World Tour teams and continental teams learn from their success and how they approach the season? I hope this question makes sense. Those are all the questions that I have for now. Thank you again to you guys, and more power.
I feel like she's referring to Need Fisher Black in a way here. Moving to Little Trek, because there was like a bit of talk about her, I think the last 2 seasons, having her opportunities at certain stage races where maybe Demi wasn't present. And I guess for some viewers, they could view how she's raced this season as underperforming in a way for what maybe some people's expectations would be. So I'm curious to see if she does move to Little Trek, what sort of role she will move into, and whether they look at her as a future GC rider and building her into that type of rider, or is she just going to slot into a similar sort of role that we've seen her play the past few years on SD Works Pro Time?
I mean, I think multiple riders that Little Trek have signed for next season are going to kind of have a second life at at the new team, not necessarily in a good way or a bad way, but they will be walking into a team that will have a very different role for them. For example, like Emma Norsgaard, who is a very talented classics rider, but has a lot of the time been kind of put into the box of being a domestique for other riders on Movistar. And I think she will be a rider who could really excel in the classics for Little Trek if they want to use her in that way. Same with Anna Henderson. We don't really know what Anna Henderson is capable of. She's obviously an incredible time trialist and a very, very strong individual, but can she perform in a stage race, like a shorter stage race, like Tour de Romandy or something like that? We don't really know. So I think, yeah, this question could apply to most of Little Trek's new signings. But I think there are a lot of other riders that I kind of can't wait to see at new teams that I think will surprise us. For example, like Chiara Consoni is rumored to be leaving UAE next year. How's that going to go for her? She's been kind of one of the star riders on that team for before it was UAE, back when she was on Valcar Travel and Service, and going to a new team when you've been in that environment that has really lifted you up for so long can either go one of two ways. And so I am curious to see what that kind of second life looks like. Same as like, Cecily Uchip Ludwig, for example. She's had many different lives over her career and has kind of fallen into this rhythm at FDJ Suez. And obviously this year she had some bad luck with crashing and injury, and still came into the second half of the season really strong. For her going to a new team next year, she's going to be in a completely different environment from when she was on Bigla, she was really the star of the show. She came to FDJ, she was still the star of the show, but while on FDJ, she kind of had to adapt to sharing leadership with like Cavalli, for example, and now Ivica Music. And she's going to go to a team that has a really, really strong leader and other ambitions with other riders, and is really good at taking the opportunities as they come. And how is that going to work for her? So I think it depends what you mean by second. It depends how you define second life. Is it like a second life like Roekus, where she's really flourished at Fenix-Deceuninck, or a second life where it's just a different environment, a different role within the team, and what does that mean for their growth as a rider and how they take on, the next season and their new contract?
So it's a good question. I'm not sure if I can answer like with true facts, but I had a quick squiz at some of the stats, and Paulina Roekus has done 41 race days so far, and Cassie Niewiadoma has only done 34, and the teams kind of had a similar stacking of race days, the highest being in the early 40s and averages around in the 30s. So I think actually Fenix-Deceuninck race just as much as other big teams. We don't see them as much maybe in the other races, but I think we're not really looking for them either. They actually did perform really well in the Spring Classics. We did talk about them quite a bit this year, really lifting, I think, from last year's Tour de France. We've really noticed them more in the races. But on the other hand, I really like this question because it does raise some good points around the importance of races and how teams do structure their year, and how that can be really good for the team and for individuals. I've always been a firm believer that having goals set out from a long way out for the team and also for individual riders is really important, and that's what gets the best out of people. What I hate is riders that get flogged and strung along and told that they need to keep proving themselves time and time again before they get their opportunity to be a race leader or to try and win a race. And I think similar can be said for the whole team approach. And I really like that it seems that the Fenix-Deceuninck team really put a lot of focus on the tour because they know they'll get a lot of publicity out of it. and they've managed to get some amazing results. So probably their whole sponsorship for the year has been totally worth it both times so far because they've nailed it. But of course, that's a risk, isn't it? Like you could have a really awful tour as well and not have put that emphasis on other races. And by the end of the season, you almost come away with nothing, and the sponsors aren't super happy about that. So I think there's a bit of a balancing point there. Individuals need to have their own goals throughout the season. But I really like the approach of having big, clear targets for the team because it makes riders accountable. They have to show up in their best shape because that has been the goal from a really long way out. And yeah, it builds like an excitement and anticipation in the team, and they're mentally fresh coming into these big goals because they haven't been flogged so much beforehand. And I think other riders, they carry a lot of pressure from their team and their environments throughout the season, and they might not be able to come to the Tour de France in their very best shape physically and mentally. So yeah, it's very cool to see this team in particular lifting so well, and I think that's also a lot to do with just their pure talent. Not every team could do that.
One more question from Scott, and then we'll wrap up this episode. Scott asked us 2 questions and sent in 2 audio diaries. And the second one really focused on racing in the US and how, in Europe we have, like in Belgium, for example, the Kopecky effect with more women signing up for racing because of the success of Lotte Kopecky. In nations like France, Italy, and the Netherlands are continuing to churn out great riders, whereas in the US, road cycling has really taken a big hit. And I'm not going to include that question because there was actually some really amazing back and forth in the Discord in regards to this question with members who are either in those races in the US, the women's races in the US, who can really speak to the on the ground happenings. And I think everyone in the Discord did an amazing job answering that question for us. So I'm going to leave that one for the Discord members. But Scott also asked us.
Hey, Wheel Talk crew. This is Scott from Washington, D.C. This has been an amazing season. The entire season has been incredible, but the tours in particular have absolutely been just top notch. The one thing I would like to see is if the tours were a little bit longer. I'd like it to be more like 2 weeks, dare I say 3, but could see where maybe that would be too much for right now. Do you think the tours should be made longer? Do you think that they should do it incrementally? And do you see any other improvements that could be made to take the sport to the next level? Thanks for all you do for cycling in general and women's cycling in particular.
I think on the ground, this was a question that came up, right, Abby? And the general consensus across all types of people working in cycling, watching cycling, the athletes themselves, was the golden number seems to be 14. A lot of people would like to race a 14-day tour. So 2 weeks with a rest day, I think. One rest day in there somewhere. I would love to see that in the next few years. Obviously, next year is 9 stages. But what I would like to see, and I think we could get this the longer that the tour gets, is that there is, I think I put this in my notes to another question here, actually. What would you like to see in the Tour de France next year? I'd like to see a more decisive mountain stage earlier in the race. I don't want to see the riders wait until basically the last day, because it felt like we hit the weekend and it was like the race was just kicking off and then it was done. I don't know what your opinion is.
Yeah, I think 14 stages is the sweet spot. The general consensus of riders is that 3 weeks is too long. And I believe we've talked about how, like, we don't even really think the men's tours should be 3 weeks. Like, I haven't watched a single stage of the Vuelta, but decided to check in at like 5:30 p.m. on Saturday just out of curiosity, and the stage was already over. And I was like, oh my God, we still have another week of this race. So I think 14 days is the perfect number of stages with, 1 or even 2 kind of rest days thrown in there to keep the racing ticking over and keep everyone fresh enough to, be able to put on a good show for us, which is the most important thing, is that the racing is fun to watch, right? And I think if it's too many stages, then you have stages that can get quite boring, and you're always going to have quieter sprint stages no matter what. But I think the women's racing has hit this really nice stride where even the sprint stages have something going on, something worth watching. Whereas like in the men's tour this year, my male colleagues on the ground were lamenting the doomed breakaways that never even tried in the men's tour this year. And we don't have that in the women's for the most part. And I think that that's not necessarily a bad thing. So I think 14 stages, but definitely more decisive stages, and not even just like big mountain stages. Stage 4 was incredible this year at the tour. The stage that finished in Liège. Stages like that really test the peloton in multiple ways. And I think, I would like to see more big mountains in the women's race in the future, because it's such a new thing for the women to have those huge decisive mountain stages, and they still don't really know how to tackle them, which is pretty fun to watch. Like, you saw 2 very, very different types of big mountain races happen this year. Like, for example, on the penultimate stage of the Giro, where they didn't really know how to take on those 2 stages. And so we didn't really get any racing until the final, 5 kilometers. And then the final stage of the tour this year, where we had it popping off from the very beginning, with SD Worx putting most of their team into the breakaway to try to use that as an advantage, that didn't work. And so there's so much to be learned from big mountain stages in the women's peloton. And I think, having maybe one more of those stages in the race would be really cool. But also, just if you have 14 stages, there's more opportunities and more teams that have a chance at winning a stage, which just makes the racing more exciting. So I think 14 is definitely, and Lauren and I talked about this a ton off mic at the tour, which kind of sussing out how the race would look and which day would it start and where would the rest day be. And I deemed the rest day would be on a Wednesday, because that was like kind of made sense in the week. But it's something that, I hope we get to see in the future, a 14 stage Grand Tour, not just for the tour though. Like, I also want to see that for the Giro and the Vuelta, because if we're going to have these 3 like quote grand tours, then I think they should all be equal in length. And it's something that not just the tour organizers need to figure out.
And in terms of team dynamics, you think of a team like FDJ Suez, if you've got these big grand tours, and we do have the 3 grand tours, you can have multiple GC leaders then as well. And there's not too much crossover, because if you're targeting the Giro, then maybe you're not going for the Tour de France.
Yeah, we'd have to see bigger team sizes and a more tiered racing calendar for that to be possible, but that would be really cool as a future wish.
Yeah, I think like everyone wants to see the tour be longer because it's such phenomenal racing, but there's so much that needs to happen for teams to be able to handle a 14-day race. And one of the big problems is, team size and the number of races that can happen beforehand that will help the team get ready for the race, or, determine who is going to go to that race, stuff like that. There's very clear steps that need to happen before we can get to 3 14 stage long grand tours throughout the season.
No, it's nothing to do with the ability of the female athletes. It's literally just logistics and people and money. That's the biggest limiting factor at the moment in the calendar.
And I think, like we talked about, earlier in the podcast, with teams are having bigger budgets and there's more money being thrown around. Riders are signing this year for more than they've ever signed for in the past. Then the numbers that are coming across, like the desks of agents, is nothing like we would have seen even a year ago. So the money is coming, and I think the growth is happening, but we've said it on the podcast before that the growth can't happen too fast because you need it to be sustainable. So I'm glad that the tour is going to 9 stages next year and not just trying to immediately go to 10. It bums me out that the Giro is dropping down to 8 stages as well as the Vuelta. Like, you want to see those grow, but yeah, I think we are headed in a good direction in terms of the teams being able to grow sustainably and pick up more riders and be able to field teams that can take on a bigger season. And yeah, what we really need is just more lower level racing to help riders that aren't in the World Tour kind of develop and be able to continue to grow into those World Tour spots and keep the sport kind of turning over, if that makes sense. But it's an absolute no on a 3-week race from me.
I don't know anyone that wants that.
Fans don't want it, riders don't want it, teams definitely don't want it. All right, well, thanks everyone for your questions, and we'll be back next week to talk about Tour de Romandy. I think we'll just wrap this episode up where we are because it's gone a little bit longer than expected. But yeah, thanks everyone for listening, and it means so much to us that we have you all who care about what we're doing enough to send us questions.